My name is Audrey. And for the longest time, the only thing that name meant was wife of Mark Dalton. It was a title I wore like a borrowed coat, 2 sizes too big and made of a material that made my skin itch. I remember the first time I stood on the precipice of their world, a world built of glass and steel and quiet, ruthless ambition. It was the night of their annual corporate banquet, a stage set for triumph and humiliation, though I couldn't have known then that my greatest humiliation would one day become my most profound victory. Before I dive into how a dismissive toast about my charming little garden led to an innovation that shook a corporate giant to its core, let me just say this. They thought my passion for the earth was a quaint hobby. They never imagined that the seeds I was planting were not just for heirloom tomatoes, but for a revolution they would never see coming. I grew up with dirt under my fingernails and the scent of rain-soaked soil in my soul. My grandfather, Joe, was a farmer, but he was more of a poet whose verses were written in rows of corn and beans. He taught me that the earth wasn't a resource to be plundered, but a partner to be respected. He'd hold up a single seed, a tiny wrinkled speck in his calloused palm, and tell me, "Audrey, this isn't just a thing. This is a promise. It's a library of stories, a history of sun and rain and struggle. You treat it right and it'll feed you. You abuse it and it'll break your heart." That was my scripture. So when I went to college, studying agricultural science was not a choice. It was a calling. I wanted to understand the language of the soil, the genetics of resilience, the quiet symphony of a sustainable ecosystem. I met Mark Dalton in my final year. He was in the business school, handsome and charming, with a confidence that seemed to generate its own gravity. He was fascinated by my world, or so I thought. He'd listen, eyes wide, as I talked about nitrogen-fixing cover crops and the incredible genetic diversity of heritage grains. He called my passion pure and real. I was in love not just with him but with the idea that our worlds could merge. His, a world of global logistics and market share, and mine, a world of patient observation and nurturing growth. I thought we could build a bridge. I was naive. I mistook his curiosity for respect. The first time I met his parents, Arthur and Eleanor Dalton, was at their estate. It wasn't a house. It was a statement. A sprawling modernist monolith of stone and glass that seemed to hold the surrounding manicured landscape in a state of clinical submission. There wasn't a single weed, not a blade of grass out of place. It felt sterile, like a museum exhibit on wealth. Arthur Dalton was exactly as you'd picture him. Tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes that didn't just look at you, they assessed you. They calculated your net worth, your utility, your place in his orbit. When Mark introduced me, mentioning with pride that I'd just graduated at the top of my class in agricultural science, Arthur gave me a thin, bloodless smile. "Ah, excellent," he said. His voice a low rumble of condescension. A bit of rustic charm. "It's important to have hobbies." He turned to Mark, clapping him on the shoulder, and the conversation immediately shifted to quarterly earnings. I was dismissed. A footnote in my own introduction. Eleanor was subtler, her dismissals wrapped in the silken ribbon of high society politeness. "Oh, you work with your hands," she'd said, looking at my short, clean nails as if she could see the phantom dirt beneath them. "How grounding. I find a good manicure is all the connection to nature I require." She laughed, a light, tinkling sound that didn't reach her eyes. Over dinner, served on porcelain so fine I was afraid to breathe on it, I tried to engage. I spoke about the potential for integrating sustainable practices into their supply chain, how it could even be a marketing boon. Arthur listened with the pained patience of a man waiting for a child to finish a rambling story. "My dear," he said, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin, "Dalton Foods feeds 200 million people a day. We operate on a scale of efficiency and profit. We deal in commodities, not feelings. This sustainable business is a luxury for boutique markets and sentimentalists. It's playing in the dirt. We're busy running the world." Mark squeezed my hand under the table. A small, desperate gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt like a plea for my silence. "Just let it go," the pressure said. "Don't make waves." And because I loved him I did. I smiled, a tight, painful stretch of my lips, and said nothing. That became the pattern of my life for the next 5 years. I was the lovely wife with the charming little garden. My degree, my passion, my entire field of knowledge was reduced to a quirky personality trait, a cute footnote to the grand, important story of the Dalton family. We lived in a house they'd bought for us, another glass box filled with beige furniture and art that was chosen for its investment potential. I tried to make it a home. In the backyard, I ripped out the perfect, soulless lawn and built raised garden beds. That was my sanctuary. I ordered heirloom seeds from tiny co-ops, seeds with names like Cherokee Purple and Moon and Stars. I nurtured them, saved their seeds, and felt a connection to my grandfather, to a world that was real and alive. The Daltons found it amusing. They'd tour the garden during their visits, Eleanor holding her cocktail aloft as if navigating a minefield. "Oh, look, Arthur. Audrey has grown a lumpy tomato. How rustic." Arthur would nod. "Keeps her busy, I suppose." Mark was caught in the middle, a perpetual apologist for his family's behavior and my hurt feelings. "They just don't understand, Audrey," he'd say late at night after his parents had left, leaving a chill in the air. "They're from a different generation. They see things differently. They see me as a simpleton, Mark. They think my life's work is a joke." "It's not a joke to me," he'd insist, but his actions never backed up his words. The worst incident before the very end was when I tried to contribute professionally. I spent a month researching and writing a detailed proposal. Dalton Foods had a subsidiary that produced snack foods, and their supply chain for vegetable oils was notoriously inefficient and environmentally damaging. My proposal outlined a transition to working with a consortium of smaller, sustainable sunflower oil producers. It would improve community relations, create a positive marketing story, and in the long run, stabilize their supply against climate volatility. I was so proud of it. I thought, this finally is the bridge between our worlds. This is something they have to respect. I gave it to Mark, who promised to show it to his father. A week later, he called me to the Dalton Corp headquarters for a meeting. My heart hammered with a nervous hope. I walked into the cavernous boardroom, a temple of dark wood and brushed steel. Arthur was at the head of the table, flanked by 2 severe-looking vice presidents. Mark was there, but he wouldn't meet my eye. My proposal was on the table, but it was closed. Arthur gestured for me to sit. "Audrey," he began, his voice dangerously smooth. "Mark shared your document with me. It's very passionate." He paused, letting the word hang in the air like an insult. "We appreciate the effort. However, Dalton Corporation is not a charity. We don't make business decisions based on feel-good stories about happy little sunflowers. We have contracts. We have infrastructure. We have a bottom line. What you're suggesting is a logistical nightmare and a financial black hole. It's amateurish." He slid the proposal across the table toward me. "Stick to your garden, my dear. It's where you do your best work." The air was sucked out of the room. The 2 vice presidents stared at their hands. I looked at Mark, my eyes pleading with him. Say something. Defend me. Defend my work. He just sat there, his jaw tight, a faint flush creeping up his neck. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't." I felt a cold, hollowing shame. It wasn't just that my work was rejected. It was the public, condescending manner of the execution. I was a child who had presented a crayon drawing to a board of architects and been patted on the head for my effort. I stood up, my legs trembling. I took my proposal, my month of work, my hope, and I walked out of that room without a word. That night, Mark tried to smooth it over. "He's under a lot of pressure, Audrey. The shareholders." He could have been gentler, I know, but his points weren't entirely wrong from a purely business perspective. It wasn't a business perspective, Mark. It was a public execution. He did that to humiliate me. And you let him. You sat there and you let him. What was I supposed to do? Argue with my own father in front of his VPs? My career would be over. And that's it, isn't it? I thought. Asterisk your career, the company, family, and me. I'm just the girl with the garden. Asterisk that was the night the first real crack appeared in the foundation of our marriage, a deep, jagged fissure that would never truly heal. I stopped trying to build a bridge. I retreated into my sanctuary, my garden, the only place where I felt my knowledge had value, where the language I spoke was understood. I started to pour my loneliness and my frustration into a new project, something just for me. My grandfather had left me his old seed bank, a dusty wooden box filled with carefully labeled envelopes. In it was a strain of wheat he had been working on, a local variety that was hardy but had a low yield. He'd scribbled a note on the envelope. Good bones. Needs a better coat. I started to experiment, crossbreeding it with other heirloom strains known for their resilience. It was my secret rebellion, a quiet act of defiance conducted in a small greenhouse at the back of my garden. It was the only thing that was truly mine. The years that followed were a blur of polite dinners and quiet desperation. Mark climbed higher up the corporate ladder, becoming ever more a reflection of his father. He was made Executive Vice President of Research and Development, a position created with one primary goal: win the National Prize for Agricultural Innovation. It was an obsession for Arthur. Dalton Corp, for all its market dominance, was seen as a relic, a behemoth of old-world industrial agriculture. The prize was for cutting-edge thinking, for breakthroughs in sustainability and food security. It was the one thing Arthur's money couldn't outright buy, and it drove him mad. He poured hundreds of millions of dollars into a state-of-the-art lab, hiring a team of top geneticists to develop a genetically modified corn that could thrive on minimal water. It was their ticket to legitimacy, to being seen as innovators, not just profiteers. Mark was consumed by the project. Our conversations, once filled with his apologies and my resentments, now became monologues about his work. He'd come home late, smelling of the sterile lab, and talk endlessly about gene splicing, protein markers, and the immense pressure from his father. We had a contamination in the sea wing today, he'd sigh, rubbing his temples. Set us back at least 2 months. Dad was apoplectic. He never asked about my day. He never asked about my garden. He didn't know that while his multi-million-dollar lab was struggling with contamination, my humble greenhouse had produced a success. I had done it. After dozens of failed crosses, I had a new strain of wheat. It was a beautiful plant, tall and golden, with a full head of grain. But its real magic was hidden in its roots and its cells. In my own small-scale stress tests, withholding water, simulating drought conditions, it was thriving. It was incredibly drought-resistant. I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years, a pure, unadulterated joy of creation. I ran into the house, my hands smudged with soil, holding one of the stalks like a scepter. Mark, look what I did. I explained it to him, the crossbreeding, the selection process, the incredible resilience it was showing. Thought maybe this time he would see. Maybe this was the thing that would finally make him understand my world. He glanced up from his laptop. His eyes glazed over with corporate fatigue. He took the stalk of wheat and rolled it between his fingers. That's nice, honey. Really? It's pretty. He handed it back to me. Look, I'm sorry, I'm just swamped. Dad's calling a crisis meeting tomorrow. The corn project is a disaster. The yields are unstable. We're a decade in and millions down the drain. And we're no closer to that prize than when we started. He turned back to his screen. We're talking about feeding the world on a global scale, Audrey. Genetically engineered solutions. I just don't have the headspace for a backyard patch right now. Backyard patch. The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. All my work, my knowledge, my one moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, reduced to a triviality. It wasn't just that he was dismissive. It was the chasm between his world and mine that he so effortlessly highlighted. His world was important, global, a matter of millions of dollars and feeding the world. My world was a backyard patch. Hobby. Cute. I stood there in the middle of our sterile living room, holding my golden stalk of wheat, and I felt the last vestiges of hope for us crumble into dust. The bridge wasn't just burned. It was clear it had never existed at all. I was on one side of a vast canyon, and he was on the other, and he had no interest in ever crossing. He didn't even see the value in what was on my side. I quietly went back outside to my garden, my sanctuary, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something had to break. I just didn't know it would be so soon or so public. The night of the annual Dalton Corporation banquet arrived like a dreaded anniversary. It was the same grand hotel ballroom, the same sea of expensive suits and glittering dresses, the same oppressive atmosphere of forced celebration and cutthroat ambition. By this point, I had perfected the role of the decorative wife. I wore the dress Mark had picked out, a tasteful but forgettable sheath of navy silk. I smiled, I nodded, I made meaningless small talk with the wives of other executives. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of a world I despised. The air was particularly thick with tension this year. The failure of the drought-resistant corn project was the skeleton at the feast, an open secret everyone politely ignored. Arthur Dalton was in a foul mood, his smiles tighter, his handshakes more crushing than usual. I sat at the head table, a prop next to Mark, who was trying to look relaxed and failing miserably. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. I could feel the weight of Eleanor's critical gaze from across the table, cataloging my posture, my jewelry, my very existence. I ate without tasting, drank without feeling, the clink of silverware and the drone of conversation washing over me. Then came the speeches. CO. SIFO. A litany of self-congratulation, of record profits and market expansion. And then Arthur Dalton walked to the podium. A hush fell over the room. This was the main event. He was a master orator, capable of inspiring and intimidating in the same breath. He began by speaking about the challenges of the past year, a veiled reference to the R&D failure. He spoke of resilience, of the Dalton spirit, of overcoming adversity. Then he turned his attention to his son. But through all these challenges, he boomed, his voice resonating through the microphone, I have been so proud to watch the leadership of my son Mark. He gestured to Mark, and a wave of polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Mark stood up, gave a modest nod, and sat back down, a look of profound relief on his face. He had survived his father's public scrutiny. I felt a flicker of something, pity maybe, for the man beside me, so desperate for the approval of a man who used it as both a weapon and a reward. Arthur let the applause die down, a smirk playing on his lips. Mark has shown tremendous fortitude. He is the future of this company. But a man like that is not built in a vacuum. He needs a strong foundation, a support system. He paused, and his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, found me. He raised his glass. My stomach twisted into a knot of ice. Asterisk, oh no. Please no, asterisk, and so, Arthur continued, his voice dripping with a syrupy, patronizing warmth. I also want to toast his lovely wife, Audrey. The spotlight swung, catching me in its brutal, unforgiving glare. I felt hundreds of pairs of eyes turn to me. I could feel the heat on my skin. I wanted to shrink, to disappear into the navy silk of my dress. Audrey, he said, and the whole room hung on his words. She keeps us all grounded. He let the word hang there, a deliberate, cruel pun. A few people tittered. She reminds us of the simple things. While we're up here in the stratosphere dealing with global markets and billion-dollar decisions, she is right there, with her hands in the soil. His smile widened. So let us raise a glass to Mark for his incredible success, and to his lovely wife, who keeps us all grounded with her charming little garden. The room erupted in applause and laughter. It wasn't malicious laughter from most. It was polite, social laughter. The kind of laughter that says, we get the joke. The joke was me. My life's work, my passion, my very identity, served up as the punchline to a corporate toast. It was the boardroom humiliation all over again, but this time it was magnified 100-fold, performed on a stage with a spotlight. I looked at the faces at our table. Eleanor was beaming a tight, triumphant smile. Arthur was basking in the glow of his own cleverness. And Mark. I turned to Mark, my husband, the man who had promised to love and honor me. He was smiling. A weak, pained, apologetic smile, but a smile nonetheless. He gave me a tiny shrug, a microscopic gesture that screamed, "Asterisk, what can you do? Just dad being dad." Asterisk. And in that moment something inside me didn't just crack. Vaporized. The part of me that had been holding on, hoping, making excuses, simply ceased to exist. It was a moment of terrible, absolute clarity. This was not my life. These were not my people. The man beside me was a stranger, a willing accomplice to my slow, public erasure. The years of quiet dismissals, the backhanded compliments, the patronizing smiles, all coalesced into a single point of unbearable pressure. The sound of the applause faded into a dull roar in my ears. The glittering chandeliers blurred into streaks of light. All I could see was my grandfather's face, his kind eyes, his calloused hand holding a single promising seed. "This is a library of stories," he had said. And I knew my story would not end here as a footnote in theirs. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I did something far more terrifying to them. Became calm. A cold, sharp, preternatural calm settled over me. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table beside my untouched dessert. I stood up. The movement was small, but at the head table in the wake of the toast, it was a cannon shot. The conversation around me faltered. Arthur, who had just returned to his seat, looked up at me. His brow furrowed in annoyance. Eleanor's smile faltered. Mark's eyes widened in panic. "Audrey, what are you doing?" he hissed. I didn't look at him. I looked down the long table at the faces of the people who had just laughed at me, and I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt. Just done. I turned and walked away from the table. The journey from the head table to the ballroom doors felt like a mile. Every head turned to watch me. The silence was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of astonishment. I could feel Mark scrambling up behind me. He caught my arm in the grand marble-floored lobby, just outside the ballroom doors. His grip was tight, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he whispered, his voice shaking with fury. "You're embarrassing me. You're embarrassing my family." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I felt as if a veil had been lifted. I saw not the charming man I had fallen in love with, but a weak, frightened boy, terrified of his father. "No, Mark," I said, my voice as steady as stone. "You've been embarrassing me for years. I just finally stopped letting you." "It was a toast, Audrey." "Joke. You're being hysterical. You always overreact." "Do I?" I asked, and the question was genuine. I searched his face for a single flicker of understanding, of empathy for the public stripping of my dignity he had just witnessed and condoned. There was none. Only indignation. Only concern for his own social standing. A joke about my charming little garden. That's all my entire life is to you people, isn't it? A cute little hobby to keep the little woman busy. That's not true, and you know it. Isn't it? When have you ever not once stood up for me? When have you ever told your father that my work has value? When have you ever seen me as anything more than an accessory to your life? He stared at me, speechless. He had no answer. 'Cause there was no answer. I slowly, deliberately, pulled my left hand from his grasp. I twisted the heavy diamond engagement ring off my finger. Felt strangely light. I pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. "I'm done," I said again, the words tasting of freedom. "I'm done being your lovely wife. I'm done being your charming little footnote." I turned my back on him, on the opulent hotel, on the entire glittering, soulless world of the Daltons. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked out into the cool night air of the city, taking my first breath as a free woman. I had no plan. I had no destination. All I had was the ground beneath my feet, and, for the first time in a very long time, it felt solid. The first few weeks were a disorienting mix of grief and exhilaration. I had walked away from my marriage, my home, my entire life, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a core of cold, hard resolve. I stayed on the couch of an old college friend, Sarah, who took one look at my face the night I showed up on her doorstep and simply opened the door wider. No questions asked. The silence in her tiny apartment was a balm after the constant noise of the Daltons' world. There were no expectations, no condescending remarks, just the quiet hum of a life lived on its own terms. Mark called, of course, dozens of times. At first, his messages were angry and demanding. Then they became pleading. He didn't understand. He thought I'd come back after I'd cooled off. He couldn't comprehend that the break was final. I never answered. There was nothing left to say. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman Sarah had recommended, handled the divorce. It was surprisingly swift. The Daltons, for all their power, valued discretion above all else. They wanted this embarrassment to disappear. They offered a settlement, a generous one designed to buy my silence. I refused it. I didn't want their money. It felt like blood money, payment for the years they had tried to suffocate me. All I wanted were my personal belongings, my books, and the contents of my greenhouse. And one other thing, the small farm in the countryside that my grandfather had left me. It had been part of our prenuptial agreement, listed as my sole and separate property. It was my only real asset, my inheritance. It was my only hope. The day the moving truck arrived at my grandfather's old place was the first day I felt like I was truly home. The farmhouse was small and weathered, the paint peeling, the porch swing creaking a lonely song in the wind. But it was real. The fields were fallow, choked with weeds, but the soil was rich and dark. It smelled of life. In the old barn I found my grandfather's tools, rusted but sturdy. And I had the box of his seeds, my precious library of stories. I also had the carefully wrapped cuttings and seed heads from my own miracle wheat, the project Mark had dismissed as a backyard patch. I laid it all out on the dusty kitchen table, and I felt a sense of purpose so profound it made me weak in the knees. This was my ground. I would not be kept grounded. I would build from the ground up. The inheritance included a small amount of money, enough to live on for a year if I was frugal, but not nearly enough to start a proper farming operation. I knew I couldn't do it alone. The idea began as a whisper, a crazy, improbable dream. What if I wasn't the only one? What if there were other small farmers in the area, people who believed in sustainable agriculture but were being squeezed out by giants like Dalton Corp? What if we pooled our resources? Our land, our equipment, our knowledge. Co-op. The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. My first attempt to recruit someone was a spectacular failure. I drove out to a neighboring farm owned by a man named George, a grizzled farmer in his 60s who had been working his land his whole life. I pitched my idea with all the passion I had. He listened, chewing on a piece of straw, and when I was done he just spat on the ground. A co-op. That's socialism, little lady. I run my own farm. Don't need no help from anyone, especially not some city girl playing farmer. He'd heard the whispers, of course. The Dalton wife who had run off. To him I was a joke. I was discouraged, but I wasn't defeated. I spent the next few months working my own land, bringing a few acres back to life, planting a large test plot of my drought-resistant wheat. The physical labor was grueling. My body ached in ways I never knew it could. There were days I would collapse into bed, covered in dirt and sweat, and wonder if George was right. If I was just a city girl playing at a life I couldn't handle. But then the sun would rise, and I would see the first green shoots of my wheat pushing through the soil, and the hope would return. My breakthrough came in the form of Maria Garcia. She was a legend in the local farming community. A third-generation farmer in her late 50s, she ran a small but incredibly successful organic vegetable farm. She was known for her fierce independence and her distrust of outsiders. I knew convincing her would be the key. I went to the local farmers market where she sold her produce. I didn't try to pitch her. I just bought her vegetables every week. I told her how much I admired her work. I asked her questions about soil health, about pest control. I showed her my knowledge wasn't just academic. For a month, she was polite but distant. Then one day, a freak early dry spell hit the region. It didn't last long, but it was enough to stress the crops. The next time I went to the market, I brought her something. It was a small bouquet of my wheat, the stalks tall and golden, the heads full of grain, completely unfazed by the lack of rain. I just handed it to her. "This is what I'm working on," I said simply. She took it, her practiced fingers examining the grain, her sharp eyes taking in the healthy stalk. She looked from the wheat to me, and for the first time, her expression softened from skepticism to genuine curiosity. "Drought-resistant?" she asked, her voice low. He nodded. "Completely. Through traditional crossbreeding. No GMO." She was silent for a long time, just looking at the wheat. Finally, she looked up at me. "All right, city girl," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "Come to my farm on Tuesday. We'll talk." That was the beginning. Maria was the first to join. Her trust was a seal of approval in the community. With her on board, 2 other small family farms signed on. We called ourselves the Viridian Farms Co-op. We pooled our land for crop rotation. We shared the cost of a new tractor. We shared our knowledge. Maria taught me the practical realities of farming at scale, and I shared my scientific knowledge of soil microbiology and plant genetics. We were a team. It was hard. We argued. We struggled. We faced setbacks. One devastating hailstorm wiped out half of Maria's tomato crop. We almost didn't make our first loan payment. During that time, Mark showed up at the farm one afternoon. He drove his sleek, expensive car down my bumpy dirt driveway, looking completely out of place. He was thinner, his face etched with a stress that had nothing to do with corporate pressure. He said he was worried about me. He said he missed me. Then he made his pitch. "Dad and I have been talking," he said, avoiding my eyes. "We feel bad about how things ended. We want to help you. We could set you up with your own project at Dalton. Real one. We'll fund a community garden initiative. You could run it. It would be perfect for you." I just stared at him. After everything, he still didn't get it. He still saw me as the hobbyist. He was offering me a gilded cage, a bigger, more expensive version of the charming little garden his father had mocked. He wanted to absorb my rebellion, to sanitize it and turn it into a PR-friendly subsidiary of Dalton Corporation. "No, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't want your project. Have a project. It's this." I gestured to the fields, to the barn where the other co-op members were sorting seeds. "This is real. This is mine. And it is not for sale." The look of utter incomprehension on his face told me everything I needed to know. He drove away, and I knew I would never see him again. It was a sad, quiet ending to a loud, painful story. Just as we were starting to gain some financial stability, a letter arrived. It was from the Dalton Corporation's legal department. It was a cease and desist order. Their lawyers claimed that the wheat strain I was developing was substantially similar to a patented gene sequence their R&D department had been working on, and they were accusing me of corporate espionage. It was ludicrous, a baseless accusation designed to intimidate and bankrupt us with legal fees we couldn't possibly afford. They claimed that my access to Mark while he was head of R&D was proof of my intent. It was a desperate, ugly tactic. Maria was furious. The other farmers were terrified. For a moment, it felt like the giant was finally going to crush us. But they had underestimated me. And they had underestimated the power of the story I now had. I didn't hire a fancy lawyer. I contacted Dr. Chen, my old university mentor. He had followed my post-divorce journey with quiet pride. When I explained the situation, he was incensed. He helped me meticulously document every step of my breeding process, pulling my old lab notes from my university projects, showing the clear lineage from my grandfather's heirloom seeds. We had a paper trail that went back years before Dalton had even started their failed corn project. We countersued, not for money, but for a public retraction and an injunction against corporate harassment. Faced with a public fight where they would be portrayed as a billion-dollar corporation bullying a small farming co-op started by the CEO's ex-daughter-in-law, they quietly withdrew the claim. We had won. It was a small victory, but it solidified us. We were no longer scared. We were survivors. The next 2 years were a blur of hard work and steady growth. Our co-op became a model of success in the sustainable agriculture community. We supplied organic produce to restaurants and grocers throughout the state. And my wheat, which I officially named Audrey's Promise, in honor of my grandfather's note, was a triumph. It passed every field trial with flying colors, producing high yields with 40% less water than conventional strains. It was the culmination of everything I believed in. A solution born not from a sterile lab and genetic modification, but from patient observation, traditional breeding, and a deep respect for the genetic heritage stored in a simple seed. On Maria's urging, we submitted it for the one prize I knew would get the Daltons' attention: the National Prize for Agricultural Innovation. It felt like a shot in the dark, a tiny co-op going up against multi-billion-dollar agribusinesses. But as Maria said, they call it innovation, not most money spent. Let's see what they really value. The award ceremony was held in a different city, in a different, grander ballroom, but the feeling of being an outsider was the same. This time, however, I wasn't alone. I had my team with me. Maria, looking wonderfully out of place and entirely unimpressed in a dress she'd complained about all evening. The other co-op farmers and their families, their faces a mixture of awe and nervous excitement. We were a small island in a sea of corporate sharks. And then I saw them. Across the room, at a prime table near the stage, sat Arthur, Eleanor, and Mark Dalton. My heart gave a painful lurch. I hadn't expected them to be here. Course they were. They were nominated for the 10th year in a row for a minor modification to a pesticide formula. A nomination bought by their reputation, not their results. Arthur saw me. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise before his usual mask of arrogant indifference slammed back into place. He leaned over and said something to Mark, who then looked in my direction. His face was a complicated canvas of emotions I couldn't begin to decipher. He looked away quickly. For the rest of the pre-ceremony dinner, I could feel their eyes on me, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. They were watching me, and I knew they were thinking the same thing everyone else was. What was she doing here? The little wife with the garden, at the most prestigious agricultural science awards in the country. The ceremony began. Award after award was given out for various categories. My stomach was a churning knot of anxiety. I kept telling myself that just being nominated was the victory. That it didn't matter if we won. But it did. It mattered desperately. Finally, the presenter, a renowned agronomist, walked to the podium to announce the final and most prestigious award of the night. And now, she said, her voice echoing in the silent room, the National Prize for Agricultural Innovation. This award recognizes a breakthrough that promises to fundamentally change our relationship with agriculture and enhance our global food security. She spoke about the challenges of climate change, of desertification and widespread drought. My hands were sweating. Maria reached over and squeezed my arm. "Breathe, city girl," she whispered. The presenter continued. The nominees this year were exceptional, representing the brilliant minds dedicated to solving these problems. From advancements in hydroponics to new frontiers in genetic engineering. She gave a polite nod in the direction of the Dalton Corp table. Arthur sat up a little straighter. But this year, the presenter said, a real warmth entering her voice, the committee was unanimous. We chose to honor a project that is, in many ways, a return to first principles. A project that reminds us that sometimes the most profound innovation comes not from overriding nature, but from listening to it. It is a testament to the power of heritage, patience, and the brilliant application of classical plant science. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break free. This couldn't be happening. The prize is awarded for the development of a high-yield, open-pollinated wheat strain with unprecedented drought resistance. The air in the room was electric. I risked a glance at the Dalton table. Arthur's confident smirk had vanished. He was leaning forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. Mark was staring at the stage, his mouth slightly agape. This wasn't their project. They hadn't won. This achievement, the presenter beamed, opening the envelope, is proof that small-scale, collaborative, and sustainable farming can produce world-changing results. She looked out at the audience. The National Prize for Agricultural Innovation goes to the Viridian Farms Co-op for the wheat strain known as Audrey's Promise. For a second there was nothing. Just the echo of the words. Then our table erupted. Maria was hugging me, yelling in my ear. The other farmers were on their feet, clapping, cheering. I was in a state of shock, my mind a complete blank. People were pushing me towards the aisle, towards the stage. As I walked, it felt like that first walk out of the ballroom 5 years ago, but in reverse. This time I was walking towards the light, not away from it. The applause was a deafening wave. I looked out at the sea of faces, and I saw them. I saw Arthur Dalton's face. It was slack-jawed, his complexion a pasty, unhealthy gray. All the arrogance, all the power had drained out of him. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. Eleanor's hand was at her throat, her face a mask of utter, horrified disbelief. And Mark. He was just staring at me, his eyes wide with a dawning comprehension that was almost painful to watch. He finally understood. I accepted the award, a heavy, beautiful piece of sculpted glass. I stepped up to the podium, the same kind of podium Arthur had used to belittle me. But when I looked out, I wasn't afraid. I saw my team, my friends, my real family beaming up at me. Gave my speech. I didn't mention the Daltons. I didn't need to. My victory was my statement. I spoke about the co-op, about the power of collaboration. I spoke about sustainable farming not as a niche market, but as a necessary future. And then I looked out past the lights, and I spoke about my grandfather. This award is for him, I said, my voice thick with emotion. He taught me that a single seed is a promise. Tonight, I am honored to have kept it. After the ceremony we were mobbed. Reporters, scientists, investors, all wanting to know about Viridian Farms, about Audrey's Promise. I was no longer a footnote. I was the headline. As my team and I were celebrating in a quiet corner, I saw them approaching, Arthur and Mark. The crowd parted for them instinctively, a reflex born of their power and influence. They stopped in front of me. Arthur had composed himself. His face was back to its usual inscrutable mask, but his eyes couldn't hide the shock. Audrey, he said, his voice strained. A remarkable achievement. Truly. It was the first time he had ever said my name without a hint of condescension. We were, perhaps, hasty in our judgment of your work. Hasty in your judgment, I thought. You tried to professionally and personally destroy me. Your wheat strain, he continued, getting to the point. It has incredible commercial potential. Dalton Corporation would be very interested in acquiring the patent. We would, of course, be prepared to make you a very, very generous offer. Partnership. We could take what you've started and scale it globally. It was the ultimate Dalton move. If you can't beat them, buy them. Absorb them into the empire. Sanitize their victory and sell it as your own. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, a part of me might have been tempted. It was everything they represented. Money, power, global scale. It was the validation I had once craved so desperately. I looked at Arthur, then at Mark, who stood silently beside his father, a passenger in his own life as always. And I felt a profound sense of peace. I didn't need their validation anymore. Had my own. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. Thank you for the offer, Arthur, I said, my voice calm and clear. But it's not for sale. His eyes narrowed. I don't think you understand the kind of money we're talking about. Oh, I think I do, I replied. But Viridian Farms is a cooperative. Our work is not about maximizing profit. It's about building a sustainable future. Our patent will be licensed at a low cost to small farms and developing nations, not sold to the highest bidder. I looked him directly in the eye. My work is not a footnote, Arthur. And it is not a commodity. For the first time in his life, I had left Arthur Dalton utterly speechless. He just stared at me, his mind unable to process a decision that wasn't based on money or power. I gave him a small, final nod. Then I turned my back on him and his son, and I walked back to my team, to the sound of their laughter and the warmth of their friendship. I walked back to my life. A few months later, I was walking through the original field at my grandfather's farm. It was sunset, and the light was turning the endless acres of Audrey's promise into a sea of rippling gold. Maria came up and stood beside me, her hands on her hips, surveying our work. The first major harvest was about to begin. We had licensing agreements in a dozen countries. The co-op was thriving beyond our wildest dreams. You know, Maria said, a grin spreading across her face. For a city girl who was just playing in the dirt, you turned out to be a pretty damn good farmer. I laughed, a real deep laugh that came from my soul. I had a good teacher, I said, bumping her shoulder with mine. We stood there for a long time in comfortable silence, watching the sun go down on our fields. They had tried to bury me, to reduce me to the dirt beneath their feet. They never realized that I was a seed. And in that rich, dark, underestimated soil, I had finally truly learned to grow.